exist.
Yeah, because like empirically and analytically, so like on both fronts, it's just the case that humans have a, let's just say, like a time limit for argument's sake, right? As to how long they can be in this certain state that we can call the living state. And if that's true, then an endless amount of like prior events will relate to an endless amount of time, which humans cannot sustain themselves for this endless amount of time. So
Yeah,
that would
but
lead to
that
the,
seems a bit. Yeah, but look, that seems a bit sort of confused because one can think that space time sort of extends infinitely towards the past, but humans only sort of occupy a sort of finite section within that sort of space within the space time region. And if that's true, well, then it doesn't follow that if there's an infinite series of past events that human beings would have to occupy an infinite set of that space.
yeah, and I'm saying like, okay, it would just work. I just don't like this. I don't really like agree with that like methodology of approaching like the infinite, like, because what I would think like it works as if it takes one, like let's just say 1 to 2 seconds, right? I would take it to be the case that if there is some sort of infinite metric of time, I would take infinite in the non-eternal method and in the realized method. So, for example, something could be infinite in the like in relation to it always like continuing, and something can be infinite in the relation to it never ending. And the distinction I'm trying to draw here is like it's a difference between saying something is like just how do I explain this? Like, because it's usually easy to explain, but like I can't really explain it right now. So like, let's just say if someone says like that there are an infinite amount of 3D constructs within a given 4D like space, then that would be infinite. But then you can also say like, let's say our universe, for example, it's infinitely expansive. So I guess the distinction would be there's a difference between something that's infinite in nature and infinite in production.
Yeah, but that didn't address the point that I made, whether or not there's infinite production, infinite sort of extension in space. My point was talking about infinite, set of past events. And my point is simply to say that, at least from the way that you were phrasing it, it's not true that human beings, like if human beings exist and the past is infinite, that would entail a contradiction. And the way that you could resolve that really easily is by looking at, you know, a small, space time sort of slice and saying, look, human beings exist within this sort of, within the bounds of, those, space time slices that we sort of carve up. And, but, prior to that, there was infinitely many moments. Um, and that seems consistent with the, you know, with the origins of human beings existing on Earth and whatever. There isn't some further claim that you have to make about production or extension. My claim is sort of really simple, that it doesn't hinge on a lot of the other stuff that you're saying.
Yeah, I think that it just would boil down to like how we are viewing infinite here, and I said that like okay, because like if we take it to be the case that like how I defined the view, or rather how I like gave the whole distinction between like certain types of infinite, um, like the only way you could say that like it's going to be the case that it's not reduced to some like reductio is if like the infinite in question is going to be infinitely expanding rather than infinite in nature, because as I said like prior, the infinite in nature is going to be like some sort of like non-ending number that's in status. But one is non-ending in status, meaning it goes on forever, but is already like I don't know. Yeah, I like I'll bring up like the analogy, right? It's going to be some like infinite number of 3D constructs within a 4D space or something like that, and then that's in nature being infinite, and then in like let's just say growth or expansion or production, you would have like our
Yes,
universe,
yeah,
which is
I
said to be
understand. I'm aware of the distinction. You're making a distinction that's been referred to as an actual versus a potential infinite, right? I
yeah.
think using production or growth and stuff like that just kind of makes it more obscure than what it is. Just, I mean, the way that philosophers are talking about it is in terms of potential and actual infinites, which started from Aristotle, but and then sort of was adopted more recently in these debates about, uh, whether or not there could be an infinite past in the context of philosophy religion, but it's like not. I mean, so for example, someone like William Lane Craig thinks that if the past is infinite, well then that means that the moments of time are going to be actually infinite. Um, but the thing that I'm saying is that like even William Lane Craig would agree that if time is infinite in the past, that doesn't mean that human beings couldn't exist. I mean, Craig has different sort of worries as to why you couldn't have like an infinite past. Craig and people like Andrew Loke have distinct worries about why that is, but it's not because you couldn't like humans couldn't exist, because they would have to be occupying an infinite sort of space-time region or whatever. That's not at all like what's at issue. What's at issue is like suppose look, if you think that an infinite past renders an actual infinite, meaning that it's already instantiated, what exactly is the contradiction there? That's because you said there was a sort of, you called it a performative contradiction, which I mean, performative is like not something that philosophers use when they're talking about contradictions. They talk about things that entail something that's like true and false at the same time, or you got a proposition and its negation simultaneously true. So, which I mean, you don't get that from an infinite regress, as the way that I've stipulated and the way that's sort of relevant for these sort of conversations among philosophers.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, I could just like lay out the contradiction, right? What I said, like, you could just drop the performative if it's like, muddying the waters. But like, what I meant to say is that it's going to be the case that, like I said, if we are like, because like under the semantics I laid out, right, or under the views that I've like appealed to, right, then if it is the case that they hold true, then it would just be an infinite, as you said, an infinite amount of actualized like time that humans would have had to go through another event, which obviously, as I said, would be a contradiction to their nature because humans aren't eternal beings. They can't exist for these like infinite amount of times because they have like I guess, and I called it a time limit. They have a time limit of which they are allowed to live before certain things start happening that eventually lead to the let's just say the stoppage of their lifespan. And like the reason why is what was I gonna say? Yeah, the reason why is just gonna because if it is the case, right, that humans are eternal in nature, then that's just a contradiction, like in of itself.
Yeah. Because I think that you're not really using the terminology that's usually used, is the worry that if there was like an infinite past and you would have to traverse an infinite in order to get to the present moment. And then are you suggesting that like human beings could have never arise if you had to traverse an infinite? Is that like the way that you'd put
Yeah.
it, or is the worry a bit different?
No, that's like it. I'm saying that if it is the case that there's these infinite moments of time, then it would just be the case that things like humans can exist, and they obviously do exist. That's what I said. That's what I had said earlier.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the issue with that is that you you actually don't have to traverse an infinite amount of moments. And the reason and the way that you could sort of see this sort of clearly is that um, if the past is infinite and you were thinking about, how do you get to the present moment? Oh, the way that you can see that this doesn't require an infinite amount of moments is because, or it doesn't not account, it doesn't require you to traverse an infinite amount of moments, is the fact that you have a stopping point, which is the present. So that means that you're counting down, you know, and there's nothing incoherent, with saying that, like, for example, suppose that, you know, God exists and God had ordained someone infinitely far into the past to count, all the negative numbers down uh, until the present moment. And today they finally said, let's say, zero. Now you might say, like, how did this person, like, why did they stop counting today? How did they get to zero today? A simple way to explain that is by saying, well, it's because yesterday they were on -1 and they count, maybe one number per day. And so that's the way that they got to zero. Now, them getting to zero means that there is a designation or a point to which, the stop or the last number sort of reaches. Now, it would be true if the opposite were the case. So if you wanted to think about a being who was counting up, let's say, all the natural numbers from 1, 2, 3 up to infinity, there's never going to be a point at which that agent is going to stop. And the reason for that is because the amount of numbers that they have to count is going to be exponentially growing. For any finite number that they're at, you can always add another number to that. Um, and so they're always going to be counting. So there's never going to be a moment at which they, sort of complete, you know, count, their counting sequence. But if their counting sequence does have a stopping point, in which case, in this time we're thinking about the present, they would, you could put them into a sort of correspondence to the negative numbers, representing each past event, and like let's say the number 0 representing the present, and they get to the present by virtue of the fact that for each prior moment they were at, like let's say some number n, prior to the present moment, which is 0.
Yeah, I mean, it just would go back to like what you said earlier regarding possible infinites versus actualized infinites, regarding to like what we are like like relative to the conversation. And I said that if you were referring to a possible infinite, which would relate to like some type of eternal like time, or rather some eternal like predicate, then I was just saying that that wasn't what I was referring to when I mentioned some sort of infinite time. I was like saying that okay, it would be an actualized infinite like moment of time if it was the case that the infinite regress is true. Um because as I said, right, the infinite regress would just be an infinite amount of moments prior to like the current, because it would rely on like this never ending chain which would be by virtue of its like definition infinite, and therefore humans wouldn't have the capability of living within these infinite moments because, as I've explained, they're actualized infinites, not possible infinites.
Yeah, no, but my worry was attacking the actual infinite. So what you said, it isn't accurate to say that what I had said rested on a mistake between potential and actual infinites.
Wait, so how would you account for like humans being able to go through actualized possibilities without appealing to some sort of um some sort of like view that it would just be reduced to some eternal like factor or some eternal construct of time?
What do you mean when you say they? How do you account for humans having to go through and actualize uh, infinite possibilities? What do you mean by that?
Okay, so like um yeah, so like what I meant by that, like, right, is I was asking, how do you like, because obviously us humans can't live through these, you know, infinite amounts of time. We only have finite amount of time relative to our existence as living humanoids. And so I was asking, if it is the case that this is true, how do you account for humans going under some infinite amount of time? So basically what I'm asking is,
Oh
how
yeah,
do you account?
yeah, yeah. Well, the point that's being made here doesn't require that humans go an infinite amount of time. Like nowhere, where like in my explanation that I appeal to humans as like having existed or traversing an infinite amount of time. My point
No,
was one, that you didn't even have to traverse an infinite, and then second, if that's true, that holds independently as to what facts hold about humans. So my point is sort of, it's an abstract point about the sort of, you know uh, the space-time structure as it relates to past events. It's not a point about it, like whether, like what comes out as true there does not hinge on what facts hold true for humans biologically.
no, and I'm arguing that it would because we are indirectly affected by this thing. So like, for example, the reason why I'm using humans is because their existence is like, or rather the nature of their existence, which is being some finite living humanoid, is concrete. So if you're building, what I'm doing is basically building my theory around this by saying, okay, if it is the case that this is true, then this other factor that we would like incorporate into a said view would also be false, because humans would not be able to exist as this living humanoid under these parameters. But it is the case that this is not true. So therefore, the
Yeah.
theory
Okay. So
in question has to
then
be
the
false.
dispute. Yeah. So then the dispute is going to be around your assumption that human beings couldn't exist if there was an infinite past, and so now you have to justify that assumption.
Yeah, I think it's like empirically demonstrated. Do you disagree?
Well, it's
Like,
not
okay, I
empirically demonstrated because it's not. There is unless you can point me to a consensus among the scientific community as to whether or not the past is infinite or finite, which you can't. I mean, experts in philosophy of physics and experts in cosmology don't agree upon a sort of view of, as to the origin of space time, requiring whether or not it was infinite in the past or not. They agree that at least under like the sort of Big Bang model that the universe, as at least expansion of the universe, began at a sort of at a small, when the universe was a small and hot and dense state. But we don't know exactly what sort of happened before the expansion, and our physical theories don't actually tell us that. And a sort of recent survey by Phil Hopper and I forget the his co-author. Uh, they recently had a survey where they surveyed many scientists at this sort of conference. I think it was like uh, a few thousand of them or something. And each of them sort of like not each of them. It sort of came out as a majority agreement among them in the survey results that they didn't think that the the Big Bang or something said anything about the past being infinite or be past being finite rather. Um, but yeah,
no, like, okay, what I'm saying is, like, I don't think I need to appeal to like some consensus that my theory is the case. If I could just I mean, sorry, like, like, let's just say that my argument towards a theory is the case if I can demonstrate it through some sort of like argumentation. And that's why I
well,
went
you
throughout the
do.
whole
You
proof
well,
by.
you do if yeah, but you do if the claim that you made is it can be empirically demonstrated. So you do need to show that at least among people who are working in fields, have produced empirical results that confirms what you said. So for instance, I could make some empirical claim about the world and say like, look, all scientists agree that on this one theory, and the theory says that the past is infinite, and then I can't just stipulate that and then just say like, well, that's true. And then if you say, well, give me the results or give me the study that sort of shows this, and then I can't just say like, well, I don't have to, I can just sort of give you argumentation. Well, no, because the claim that was being made rests on a sort of empirical result about the world, and unless you have that sort of empirical result, there's no reason to think that what's been said is true.
Yeah, and what I'm saying, right, is that, like, okay, so like, listen, I said that maybe that's a blunder on my part, right? And I didn't mean to say empirical. So, like, I'm just saying we can demonstrate it to be the case. But like, I don't. I think I can prove it empirically because like the human biology does not allow us to live for these infinite amount of times. Like
Yeah,
that's
but
just a
but
fact.
don't appeal to human biology because that's you're appealing to something that it's already being assumed. That's like that's the thing that's being under dispute, right? Because you're saying that human beings can live for an infinite amount of time, and my claim was that like I don't think that if there is an infinite past, they need to live for an infinite amount of time, and you're saying well they do, and then I'm saying okay justify that. You can't say well human beings can't live infinitely long. Well, that's the very thing that's under dispute. So you can't make that appeal.
No, like, okay, listen. What I'm saying is, okay, okay. Look, we both agree that humans are mortals, right?
Yeah.
And we both agree that a mortal is a finite existing being, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so if we agree that it's a finite existing being, then I'm asking how under this like view can we account for it being the case that it can undergo this infinite amount of time? Because as I said prior, that's the
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
because like
Which
yeah,
is why. Yeah. This look. I've repeated this point. A few times already. It can be true that human beings live a finite amount of time, while it's also true that how many events in the past are infinitely many. It would only be absurd if I said something like there's infinitely moments in the past, and in the past humans existed infinitely, but I didn't make that second claim. So it wasn't the claim that the past is infinite and human beings could exist for infinitely long periods of time. But the claim that you're making sort of assumes that if the past is infinite, then it does require that human beings exist an infinite amount of time. And I'm saying this isn't a problem for me, namely because that's not an assumption that I'm making. It's an assumption that you're making. to which you've yet to like sort of give reasons to think it's true, other than to sort of just repeat that human beings are mortal and that they couldn't exist for an infinitely long amount of time. And I'm agreeing with you, but that's not disputing the initial point that I said about like traversing an infinite.
Yeah, okay. I'm saying that okay, listen, and I'm saying that you're working under the fundamentals of like eternality, or like however you want to say, like we could just say eternal existence, right? You're working under the facet that time is eternal rather than infinite, and that just goes back to the possible versus actual infinite. And I said that under the view I'm arguing, right, the infinite regress is defined as an actual infinite, which is placed under time.
Yeah,
And if
yeah,
you
yeah,
define
but
the
no,
infinite
no,
regress
yeah,
as this,
yeah, but that's not something that we were disputing. I cleared up your language by saying that, like, look, the way that philosophers talk about it is by making the distinction between potential and actual infinites. And you said that, your reasons for thinking that this worry sort of holds is because if the past is infinite, it's like infinitely old. Well, then, that means that there's, an actual infinite amount of moments or whatever. And I said, look, I gave you a solution for how this can be worried. So it's not an issue on my end as to how I'm interpreting infinite. I'm not. I clarified the terms, and you agreed with them, and I clarified them in a way that's used among philosophers, and I sort of named a few of them, um, and at least the way that it's sort of relevant. The infinite is relevant in the sort of debate about time, the past, and causes or whatever. And then my point is to simply say that there isn't this point about human beings needing to exist forever or for an infinite amount of time isn't a worry at all, because the claim that I made didn't rest on, you know, any facts about human beings. And you're saying that it does, but and then when I ask you like why you think that's so, for a while you've like appealed to their biology, which again wasn't something like that's the very thing that's like under question as to whether or not they would in fact have to live an infinitely long amount of time. And then now you're going back to saying that it's a sort of confusion on my end about the distinction between what kind of infinites we're talking about. But we agreed at the beginning, once I cleared it up, that we were concerned with the same infinites.
yeah, okay, wait. So the reason why, like the like methodology used of clearing up was providing two sorts of descriptors of infinity, which is what I was already hinting at. Uh, and I said, okay, working under these semantics, I'm going under the like condition that the infinite regress as I defined it is going to be an actual infinite. And the
Yeah.
like yeah, okay. And so if it's an actual infinite, then it wouldn't be eternal like existence, because um eternal would imply a possible infinite, because I explained it in the like I explained possible infinite in the way that the universe works, where it's infinitely expanding, but it's still at a like it's still at a numeral value. And I said that to say that you would, if you were saying that humans can exist under these conditions of the infinite regress, you would be like making a contradiction via what a human nature is. And I use biology to substantiate that, because we both just now agreed that a human is an infinite, like, is an infinite being, or an infinite existing being. I mean, sorry, an finite existing being. And if it's finite existing, it can't exist infinitely under an actualized infinite, because that would just
Yeah,
be
and my claim
contradictory
isn't.
linguistically.
Yeah, but you're mistaken, because I'm not saying that they have to exist infinitely. That's not what I'm saying. And by an actual infinite, what do you think that? Okay, I want to be clear, because I don't know that you're really getting this point. What do you mean by actual infinite, and is it corresponding to the way that philosophers are using the term?
Yeah, okay. When I say actualized infinite, I just reference some already conceived notion of some sort of infinite stack. So you can think of it as like,
Well, I don't want you
um,
to, to appeal to an already conceived notion. I want your conceived notion, so that we're not using some notion that's preconceived that we are getting confused on. What's your conceived notion, and is that notion the same one that philosophers are talking about when they say actual infinite? Because it's a technical term. It's a technical term that's used by experts, namely philosophers who are interested in these debates about the nature of time and whether or not
Right.
time is infinite or whatever. And so I'm asking, are you using the term that the way that they are? So in other words, what's your usage of the term? Is it the same? If not, then what are the sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as an actual infinite?
yeah, okay. Like, um, like I don't like. I thought we already cleared it up via the language when you presented an
Yeah,
actualized. versus a
Yeah, well, it wasn't cleared up because you attacked my point by saying that I was making a mistake confusing a potential versus an actual infinite. So I want you to sort of just give me your understanding of an actual infinite. Give me the necessary and sufficient conditions so that we work under that sort of notion. Okay? Because obviously when I had sort of gave the notion earlier, you replied to me by saying that I was confused as to what infinite we were concerned with when I had stipulated what exact infinite I was talking about.
Yeah, okay. The wording you were using seemed as if you were talking under some like eternal existence, which would be a possible infinite. And I just think that that's distinct from an actualized infinite, which would like we could just say it will refer to some complete infinite totality that exists as a whole. Um, and if that's the case, then that's why I'm saying it would be idiosyncratic, or rather, actually, just yeah, straight up contradictory to say that humans can live under this notion.
Are you saying that it would be contradictory to say that that humans could exist for an infinite amount of time?
Yes.
And that's not what I've been saying. So you've misunderstood my argument.
No, that's what like okay, wait, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that it would be
Yeah,
the
and what
case
I
that
had said is that if the past is infinite, meaning that there was infinitely many moments going in the past direction, meaning that there wasn't a beginning to time, then this sort of worry that you have isn't a legitimate worry. And I sort of explained that. Okay. And if you are saying that, like, okay, it's not a sort of entailment or a consequence from the things that I've said, that human beings would have to exist infinitely long, and you're saying, oh no, that's what I'm saying when you're referring to yourself, and you're saying that's what you're saying, that like, oh, they would have to, under the sort of conceived notion of infinite that you're working with, then one, either you're working with the notion of infinite that's not relevant to the debate that's concerned with what if the past is infinite, then could we get to the present moment? Either that, or you are working under that notion, but you're just confused as to what the sort of consequences of that sort of picture of time are. And look, I'll let you say one thing, and then I'll say one more thing, and then I'll leave it there.
yeah, that's fine. So like basically right. I'm just arguing that there are two possible like renditions of infinity that you can go under. One that's actualized and one that's possible. So the possible one would be akin to some type of eternality where something can exist within the given time period that would be some sort of numerical value, which is the theory I'm assuming you're working under. It could be false that I'm just not tracking. Sorry, it could be true that I'm just not tracking. But I'm arguing under actualized impossible, which means that there are, you know, a already actualized set of infinite numbers within this given time period. And so to go, through this time period, it would be infinite in nature. It would be infinitely existing. And I'm saying that's distinct from eternality, which is contradictory for a human to exist via their biology and also via the, common descriptor that we landed on when we described what a human is. And if that is the case, then that would just make it so that the infinite regress cannot happen along the other factor that I gave, which would just be well, yeah, okay, you
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is the last thing I'll say on this. I think that you're, I don't know, you're mistaken insofar as you think that if there was an infinite past, then it would require that there is a sort of space-time region. Suppose that we're thinking about space-time region as a sort of four-dimensional block. Okay. And we're saying that, let's say, at the very edge of the block, at one side of the block, there's a sort of edge, and that's like the present moment. But before that edge, on the other side of the block, it just goes infinitely long. The block is infinitely long. And, for the sake of analogy, we can keep it in that way. You're saying that if the block is infinitely long in one direction, but sort of, has a stopping point, on the other side, which is, let's say, the present, you're saying that that would entail that human beings would have to exist for an infinite amount of time. Assuming, and the reason why I'm saying that you would have to think that is because the notion that's relevant when talking about infinite regresses is the notion that thinks that is capturing there being infinitely many moments in the past direction. Okay, so if that's right, well then your assumption is just mistaken, because there is no reason to think that if the past directed portion of the block that we're imagining is infinitely long, that it requires that for each sort of portion of that block that it's occupied by human beings, right? And the reason why that's true is because you could sort of cut up, a finite sort of piece of that block and say, look, within this sort of, time slice or, space-time region, humans inhibit this, and, humans exist in the present moment, so they're going to be inhibiting, existing at those moments or whatever. But it doesn't require any sort of further commitment as to whether or not human beings, exist infinitely in the past or whatever. And this is like, I agree with you that given human beings' nature, given their biology, they can only live for a finite amount of time. Um, and, human beings have only been on Earth for a finite amount of time. They haven't existed on Earth forever, Okay, we can agree with all that. Okay, so now think about the past, before human beings existed, when, let's say, before even life on Earth existed, when, Earth was formed. Okay, now that's like however many billions of years ago. Okay, now think further back. Now keep adding days infinitely. None of that tells you that human beings had to exist at any of the sort of space-time regions or moments in time. And my point is simply to point out that, like, okay, if the past is infinite, you know, then it doesn't make some further commitment as to whether or not human beings do in fact occupy those sort of regions of space-time.
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate the like little, battle or whatever. It was definitely informative. Like that's like I mean, this is like actually probably like the most I've gotten into debating God's existence, so it's definitely like an experience gain.